Well, welcome to Radical Books and Politics. We have the pleasure and honor of featuring historian Chris Mahin, who has written articles on labor history and has worked on labor education. And this is a huge honor, a huge pleasure, because Chris is our first historian on the show. Welcome, Chris. So glad to have you. How you doing?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, Chris, why don't you tell the viewers about yourself?
Well, I have written a number of articles about labor history in the course of writing for. I worked with a union that was came out of the Garment and Textile Workers Union. So I wrote a number of articles about labor history for that union. I've written for a number of publications about labor history over the years. And this subject that we're going to be talking about today, the Lawrence Textile Strike, is of special interest to me because my family does live in Massachusetts.
Oh.
So, and I've been to that area a number of times. So very happy to be here.
Oh, thank you. I'm just putting down the name of the strike. Yeah, so I remember when I first moved to Chicago, way back when, you gave me a tour of these major areas in Chicago. So for sure, I know history is your interest, your interest for sure. So tell us, give us some historical background. I was telling people that I didn't know much about the 1912 Lawrence Textile Strike. I think I remember reading about it in A People's History of the United States, but it's not one that's commonly taught in grade school and in high school, right? So I don't know if you can give a little more context on this time period, and then hopefully people will come on to ask questions, or I'll be asking you questions because I'm going to be learning. So,
well, yes, the Lawrence Textile Strike is one of those strikes that either people don't know about it or it has been, in some cases, romanticized. I mean,
wow.
This was a huge strike that took place in 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It involved tens of thousands of textile workers, and it lasted between mid-January 1912 through March 1912, and it ended in a victory for the workers, but it was an extremely bitter strike that took place in the midst of a brutally cold winter in Massachusetts. But because after the strike, a song that had been written about bread and roses was included in an labor anthology, and the assertion was made that this song came out of the strike, which is actually inaccurate. The strike has become known as the Bread and Roses Strike, and that gives people the impression that somehow there was something poetic about the strike, when in fact it was an extremely brutal.
Well, I can't imagine. I've been to the East Coast, and the winters are harsh. I mean, they're harsh in Chicago, but I can't imagine being in strike for what, 3 months almost.
Almost 3 months.
Yeah, and welcome viewers. Please, if you have comments or questions, we're here with historian Chris Mahin, Chris Mahin, I can speak English. Chris Mahin, who's talking about the 1912 Lawrence Textile Strike, and he did share with us that his family is from Massachusetts. So that is amazing. So what were they striking about?
Well, okay, just some context. At that time, Lawrence, Massachusetts was to textiles what we think of as Detroit being to auto or Pittsburgh to steel. It was the leading textile center in the entire world. It was known as Textile City. It was also known as Immigrant City. And there were the entire downtown part of the city consisted of these huge textile mills, which produced both cotton and wool. And what had happened was that the state of Massachusetts passed a law restricting the number of hours that workers could work from 56 hours to 54 hours. And the result of that was that people lost pay. They lost 2 hours pay. The workers were willing to work less hours, but they wanted to maintain their same weekly wage at
right.
when they got paid on Fridays. And when they got paid, and in fact, after this law was passed, and in fact their pay was short, they spontaneously began to walk out from one mill and then from a number of others. And this blossomed into a very large strike of the majority of the textile workers in Massachusetts at that time, and this ultimately galvanized the support of people all over the country, not only the labor movement, but people within the intelligentsia, people in other sections of society. Because keep in mind that, I mean, this is Massachusetts, and
Right.
you have this is 1912, and that means that this strike is taking place before World War One. It's taking place before the Soviet Revolution. It's taking place before the 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland. It's taking place 4 years before the Vietnamese victory at Dien Bien Phu over French colonialism. You have a world that's fundamentally different from our world today.
Right.
You have a situation where the majority of textiles and clothing, the majority of clothing worn in the United States is made in the United States. You do not have the kind of world economy that we have today. There's no general agreement on tariffs and trade. There's a tariff on wool that's 100% to 200%, which is a huge tariff, which protects the textile industry. And this is the period of time it's at the end of what's known as the Gilded Age. I mean, really, you're getting into what's called the Progressive Era, but it's coming out of that post-Civil War era with the robber barons. You have the development of these gigantic trusts, the oil trust. There is what they refer to as the wool trust, these gigantic monopolies. And there's a gigantic accumulation of wealth in the hands of a small number of capitalists, as we see today. And you have a situation where the city of Lawrence has built up these huge textile mills that have drawn labor from all over the world, particularly Europe. And these textile capitalists put up posters in cities around the world showing workers carrying home bags of gold as a result it's just lying posters they're literally carrying home bags of gold. And as a result, people come to the United States and they go through Ellis Island in New York Harbor, and then they head north to Lawrence, and they find out there are no bags of gold. There's extremely low wages. You have a situation where Lawrence itself is half the city is textile workers, and almost half of those textile workers are women. 10% of them are children, and there are these brutally low wages, and people are packed together in the center of the city in these tenements where there's extreme overcrowding and there's extremely unhealthy conditions. And finally, this situation festers for some time, and then when their wages are cut, this is just the final straw, and it's spontaneous walkout.
So I can imagine, just based on these conditions that you're describing, that it shut the city of Massachusetts down. And how did the ruling class react? Was there violence with the strikers? Did they bring in the police? I mean, I'm assuming they did,
Yes, they did. Not only did they bring in the police, but they brought in the Massachusetts State Militia, a number of companies in the Massachusetts State Militia. I mean, these are soldiers with bayonets who not only prodded people with bayonets, but in one case stabbed to death an 18-year-old striker. A Syrian-American worker, John Ramy, was bayoneted to death. There was another striker who was killed, and you had a situation where there was virtual martial law in the city of Lawrence, and people are not allowed to just linger on the streets. You had to keep moving at all times, and there were tactics such as on one morning when there was a huge protest, the authorities unleashed fire hoses. I mean, we think of fire hoses being used against demonstrators as a tactic from the civil rights movement itself. Now, they had fire hoses unleashed on them in January in Massachusetts.
Jesus Christ.
A lot colder. I mean, this was freezing cold temperatures. So there's just these very brutal tactics that are used. And this, I mean, keep in mind that this is Massachusetts, and it's Massachusetts less than 50 years after the end of the Civil War. And the state of Massachusetts prides itself on that, you know, it's the birthplace of the American Revolution. It's the place of American liberty. It's the place that stood up against slavery. And here you see these essentially wage slaves revolting and martial law being imposed in an American city. And this stirs the conscience of the country. And people begin to speak out, not just other working class people, but again, some of the leading writers of the time. This is the era in which you have a number of journalists and intellectuals are beginning to expose the injustices of the capitalist system. You have the muckrakers who've developed, Lincoln Steffens and other magazine writers like this. Many of them come to Lawrence to report on the situation. Harper's Weekly, a publication that still exists, has a front page story, martial law in Massachusetts, with a picture of the Lawrence Textile Strike. And so there's this debate in the country. This strike becomes symbolic,
right,
of what's known at that time as the industrial question. You know, the question of how do we treat factory workers in this country.
And you raise an excellent point. You talk about the conditions that they were living in tenements in these cities, but what were the factory conditions like?
Well, you had extreme speed up. You had people. There was extremely unsafe conditions. I mean, again, this is before OSHA. This is before anything. I mean, to constrain the capitalists. So you have children working in these factories in a situation where say if you know there's rules about how you wear your hair so that it doesn't get caught in this machinery, but there's young children, and sometimes young girls would let their hair down, they would be caught in the machinery. I mean, there was one famous case where one of these children testified before Congress about a horrible accident involving her hair. So you just have very, very brutal conditions.
So we have some viewers on. They pop in and out. Please, viewers, feel free to ask questions in the chat or the comments, and we can address those. We're also streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So hopefully people will catch the show after. So we have historian Christopher Mahin talking about the 1912 Lawrence Textile Strike. At that, not surprising that the companies would be so brutal and the conditions would be so awful. And I don't know. I have such a visceral reaction when I hear that children are working in a factory. And I'm not sure that much has changed in the economy of today. I don't know if you can speak to that child labor, which is brutal. So what the strike went through March, which is amazing. But what you mentioned writers, what American writers or international writers supported the strikers?
Well, of course, you have Lincoln Steffens, who's a major journalist of that time. You have William Allen White, who he spoke out and he said that the immigrant workers of Lawrence personified the ideals of the American Revolution better than the people who were suppressing them. And you have a number of other people that spoke out.
That's amazing. That's a beautiful quote.
What you do have also is, this is the period of time where Greenwich Village, for instance, in New York City, is developing as a sort of center of radical bohemia. You have later the Harlem Renaissance and a certain section of the white intelligentsia that supports the Harlem Renaissance. That comes a little bit later, but you're beginning to see the stirrings of that. And so you have those forces in New York City who, they come and report on the strike. And one of the things, you mentioned the question of children. One of the ways that the that the strike really captured the imagination of the country and the concern of the country was the strikers adopted a tactic which was new to labor struggles in the United States, but which had been used in Europe and suggested by Italian immigrant workers. And that is, they made a decision to send their children out of the city of Lawrence because they were literally starving. I mean, the main union that was involved in the strike, the Industrial Workers of the World, organized soup kitchens, other groups organized soup kitchens, but the workers were not well fed before the strike, and after the strike, when they did not have paychecks, the situation was even worse. So they made a decision to send the children to, they worked with various labor unions in other cities, particularly Boston and New York, and with political parties such as the Socialist Party. They arranged for chaperones, and essentially they arranged for their children to be sent out of the city and cared for by other workers. And this was done in a very organized way. They had permission slips and chaperones were carefully vetted and so forth. And they would have ceremonies where they would go to the train station and then they would send off the children and there would be tearful goodbyes. Well, this created a situation where the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts claimed that these children were being abandoned, that they weren't going to be cared for, that some children didn't want to go. This was totally inaccurate. And so at one point, the police intervened and physically stopped and attacked a send-off of children and grabbed the children, and there was confusion and a melee, and pregnant women were beaten, children were beaten, and this became a gigantic scandal in the country. And this became such an issue that there had to be a congressional hearing about this. The First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Taft, attended the hearing. I mean, in some respects, it was similar to the kind of outrage that you see around the separation of children at the border today.
I was just thinking about that.
And this was one of the things that really made the strike just a gigantic political issue and symbol in the country at that time in early 1912. And keep in mind, this is an election year.
Sure.
And, so you have Eugene V. Debs is running for president. Teddy Roosevelt is considering whether to run for president as a third-party candidate. And so you're in this very volatile situation. You have this horror of children being beaten, pregnant women being beaten, and they're just revulsion at the city of Lawrence and the incompetence of the city authority, the brutality of the city authorities.
So, Chris, we have Daryl Mitchell on, and I just invited him to ask questions. That is disgusting, and I mean, I don't put it past the ruling class or these owners of these textile mills to be so brutal. I mean, how dehumanizing can you get to beat kids and beat pregnant women, short of disemboweling them like they did with the Native American women in this country? I find that is so egregious. And look, the fact of the matter is that they were making so much money off of these workers. What did it mean to them to increase the wages and increase the safety standards for their employees? It's probably nothing. Well, not nothing, but that to me just speaks to the mental illness that comes with acquiring wealth. I don't know if you can speak to that, because I think it's definitely worse now than it was then in terms of how the division of wealth is in this country now. And people may think that conditions have gotten safer, but we have to think about where our products come from, what the conditions are like in international situations, right? The environment, children working in factories, children mining, you name it. So I don't know if you can speak to that, Chris.
Well, I think what you have, keep in mind that when we talk about the textile industry of New England, what we're talking about is it has its roots in the cotton mills that took the cotton that was produced by slaves in the South before the Civil War and turned that into cloth. and that this was the very foundation of the capitalist system, which you have had capitalist slavery in the southern United States by slave labor, which was then sent to Massachusetts, and Lowell, Massachusetts, which is near Lawrence, was the first cotton producing center of the United States, and from there, really, you have from the cotton mills of northern New England and northern England came really the entire world capitalist system. And so you're talking about a legacy of a very, very burdensome legacy. I mean, a very ugly legacy, and a situation where the people who built that system believe in it. I mean, one of the things about Lawrence was that the main capitalist that they were fighting in that textile strike, William Wood, he was known, the workers referred to him contemptuously as Billy Wood, who owned the largest textile mill. He himself had been an immigrant from Portugal and started out, it was one of these rags to riches stories. And so when people, I mean, that was possible for a tiny handful of people to start at the bottom and become millionaires. Andrew Carnegie has a somewhat similar story. But once you've lived through that experience, you believe in the capitalist system, and you believe you're justified in paying the workers very low wages. And you think that they like the fact that you're giving them a job at all. And the element of self-delusion that went on, and of ideological justification.
Oh yeah, for sure.
No protections whatsoever for the workers. I mean, this is before the progressive era. I mean, keep in mind, this is 1912. There's no unemployment insurance, there's no Social Security, there's no Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is many decades later. There is nothing. There is just, you're on your own, baby. The government is not gonna help you in any way, and it takes decades to struggle, of which this strike was in some respects the beginning, to ultimately have a Roosevelt administration 20 years later. I mean, Roosevelt comes in he wins election in the 1932 election, which is 20 years after Lawrence. But the struggle in places like Lawrence set the stage for a critique of totally untrammeled capitalism that helps the progressives come in later.
And I think that it can't be said enough how courageous and brave it was of these workers to strike, because what you just said right there, work is life. Work was life. That was it. And that to me, that's amazing. I wish more people knew this history. But I love how you tied this history to Roosevelt, who later had these New Deals and whatnot. You mentioned though early on, and I was going to ask you to define, and you've alluded to these thinkers, this critical consciousness of the country. But what is the intelligentsia, and what did it mean for them to become involved with the 1912 strikers?
Well, okay, keep in mind, again, this is 1912, so there's really no radio, there's certainly no television, there's no internet, there's none of that. What you do have at this time is you have newspapers and you have magazines. You have very large circulation newspapers, and you have the beginning of a whole series of magazines at that time that were doing long form articles about social conditions. You had McClure's, you had the Harper's, the Atlantic Monthly. Some of these publications still exist. Some of them have gone by the wayside, but they produced a number of significant writers. Ray Stanford Baker, Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, who wrote the history of the Standard Oil Company. I mean, these people produce exposés of Rockefeller, of Carnegie. They produce exposés of the Wool Trust, of all the trusts. And this is also just a few years after Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, exposing in the meatpacking industry here in Chicago. So there's a whole section of writers and thinkers who are producing novels, who are producing long form magazine pieces exposing social condition. And then when Lawrence takes place, I mean, the reality is a lot of these people are in New York City or Boston. Those are our two centers of universities, centers of writers, and it's like 20, 30 miles from Boston to Lawrence. You can take and from New York City, it's 170 some odd miles. So you can get there in a day. And there were cases where these writers would go up there to Lawrence, and they'd be standing on the street corner, and the militia would tell them, "You got to get off the street corner." And they'd say, "We're Americans in an American city."
That's right.
And it was too bad. And they would say, "Well, this is like what the Cossacks are doing in Russia." Because this was between the two revolutions. I mean, 1912 is 7 years after the failed 1905 revolution in Russia. But there was even a situation where a group of these writers they were standing on a street corner, they were harassed. Then they went to the hotel, this main hotel, the Needham Hotel, and they're sitting in, I guess, the bar or whatever, and the officials come in and tell them women cannot smoke in the bar here, and so they just went back to New York and wrote some pretty critical stuff about what on earth is going on in the city of Lawrence. Again, keep in mind that Lawrence is not that far from Lexington or Concord. I mean, and this is the militia, which people saw as being sort of the continuation of the Minutemen who fought at Lexington and Concord. And so these sort of the social ironies and the hypocrisy raises all these questions about, here's a state that's so proud of, we rebelled against tyranny in 1776. And we supposedly, although they exaggerate the role of the elite in Massachusetts in opposing slavery, it was actually more nuanced than the legend that had come out post-Civil War. But we stood up against slavery, and here you have martial law in American City, and workers being prodded with bayonets, and one being stabbed to death with a bayonet. It just raises all sorts of questions about, what is happening to this country. Just like today, people are asking fundamental questions about American democracy. How can you have, the kind of president that we have now, and the kind of, executive actions and pardons and repression that we have now, and tear gassing of people across the street from the White House that we have now.
Yeah, and I love this history too, because the role that these reporters had was crucial, right? Without them, the story wouldn't have gotten out, and you wouldn't have had this critical consciousness grow in the country. I think we're desperate for that kind of reporting again. And I mean, that's why I'm glad we have outlets like this. But where are the long in-depth stories from the American press these days? Where is the in-depth broadcasting that speaks to the issues of the workers and not the corporations? I mean, that is amazing. Well, maybe you can speak to a press perhaps that highlight these issues that you are aware of, Chris.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of presses out there. There's a lot of people trying to expose things, I've written for the labor press. I've written for publications like the People's Tribune and national publication published out of Chicago. And I'm happy to write about labor history for anybody, and I think there are people that are trying to get the word out. And, part of it is that in looking back at that strike, one of the things that I've learned about is that you really had an audience. I mean, people were organized, people were in unions, they were in community groups, local clubs, political parties like the Socialist Party. I mean, that was a period of time where people they would join things, whatever it was, even just, non-political civic organizations of different kinds. And so there was a way for people to contribute. So I think that it's important for there to be presses, but also people have to support these institutions. They have to subscribe to the publications. They have to, forward things on the internet. through email or whatever, and spread the word really. And that's one of the things that really did happen in Lawrence.
Mm-hmm.
When they were bringing the children from Lawrence to New York City to be cared for by others, and on one of those occasions, they had a layover at South Station in Boston, which is a place I've been, a train station I've been in many times, and all the children started singing.
Oh.
Pass the time, and that then spread the word to all these travelers at this train station. So that's just an example of how a message can spread. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, that's so moving. Wow, that's amazing. And I also find it fascinating because I don't know what the relationship was with children at the time, but that they were held in high regard and seen as important is were people at the time aware that children were working in the factory?
they were. I mean, I don't think that they were aware of how young some of the children were or how brutal the conditions were. There were people tried to try to justify this by saying, "Well, some of these children don't want to go to school and they need to be kept
Right.
busy." I mean, but when they finally, as a result of the beating of these mothers at this train station, they had to have a congressional hearing, and adults testified, and then they had the children testify.
Oh wow.
And that was one of the most moving and shocking parts of the congressional testimony, in which these children, described their conditions, and they were just, they were so innocent that they were unafraid to tell the truth. They just told
Right,
the
right.
truth, and it was just shocking and that, I think, revealed to people around the country how bad the conditions were, how dangerous the conditions were, and was very important to changing the mood of the country around the strike. And because the strikers were all being portrayed as these, dangerous wild immigrants being led by outside agitators, because the workers called on leaders of the industrial workers of the world, which was a very militant trade union of that time, and they sent organizers from outside the city into Lawrence, who did a very good job in organizing the strike. I mean, the actual strike part of the effort, and that, of course, led to the charge, which we hear so often, of outside agitators.
Oh yeah, typical.
The naive people were deluded and used and manipulated by these radical outside agitators. I mean, the IWW was sort of talked about by the authorities of Lawrence the way Donald Trump talks about Antifa today. They were these dangerous people. But once the children testified, I mean, have fundamentally changed people's perception around the country. And once the mood of the public began to change, it's at that point that the owners of the textile mills in Lawrence realized that we better think about what we're doing here. We better compromise, because at that time it was absolutely critical for them to maintain public support for a high tariff. The tariff was very, very high, and the tariff was being brought up for renewal. And if they lost public support for a high tariff, that would end up costing them more money than giving the workers of Lawrence a few more pennies. So they compromised and basically granted most of the workers' demands, and the strike was victorious.
So they kept their hours. Did they increase wages? What did they want from the strike then?
They basically wanted a wage increase. I mean, that is what they want.
But they didn't improve the safety standards then?
No. In fact, there were people. In fact, a few days after they went back to work, there were a number of workers who were killed on the
Jesus,
job.
Mary and Joseph, that is outrageous.
And
you raised a really critical point, and I know we're talking, about current situation. That it seems to me that the news has done a brilliant job in some cases of showing how terrible the conditions are in the detention centers and what's happened with these families that have been separated. I don't understand how people aren't running to these detention centers to shut them down. and because and I know it's a similar narrative of these brown people encroaching on the U.S. and they're criminals. They're not though, but this is a narrative that they're criminals and drug dealers and what a term call them rapists. But these are kids. I don't understand how people cannot see the inhumanity of what's happening. And it didn't just start with Trump. This was happening back. I remember that Texas had a family detention center, and they would let the kids go out and play for an hour. They were undernourished. They didn't have enough warm blankets. They were giving them like crackers and water to eat when the company was making like over $100 a day to keep these people supposedly, you know, in good like in a good situation, and it wasn't. They were just pocketing that money. But I don't know if you can speak to that. What is it about the moral fiber, I don't know if you can, of the country that allows for this dehumanization of children today?
I think you're raising a very profound point. One of the things in reading about the strike is that you see how, really the strike took place in a world that was so profoundly different from the world we have now. At that time in 1912, people would, this is 14 years after the Spanish American War. It is, so you have, I think as a result of the defeat of Reconstruction in 1877 and then the Spanish American War, you had the development in the United States of an imperialism. And the United States went from being simply a capitalist country to being a world imperialist power, and it had incredible moral consequences for the people of the United States. That we've got a lot to answer for. We've got a lot to think about the moral damage that did to the psyche of the country and in 1912, you had a situation where you had a struggle of immigrant workers who were from all over the world, from the places in the world that could send people to the United States.
Right.
And so later you're going to have in Lawrence, decades later, you will have Vietnamese and Khmer and other languages from Asia and Africa being spoken. But at that time in 1912, there was at least 25 different languages spoken in that strike. They had to have over 50 members of the organizing committee because there was over 25 languages and they needed 2 people representing each language in case one of them got arrested. So you had a very multi-ethnic strike, but it was predominantly Europeans. What you did have in that strike that's really significant is that the Arab American workers played a very significant role in the Lawrence Textile Strike, particularly workers from Syria. They were mainly Maronite Christian. They were Arabs, and in fact, John Ramey, the 18-year-old worker who was stabbed to death, was a Syrian American, very active in the strike. So but at that time you had a situation where when people talked about the unity of workers of all ethnicities, they were mainly talking about European ethnicities. There's a side of the Lawrence Textile Strike that really was extremely internationalist. And that I think is the best thing about the strike, is that when they took the strike vote at the end, they had the vote on whether to settle the strike. They had a meeting in the Commons, in the town square of Lawrence. There were 15,000 people there, and they put it to the Big Bill Haywood got up and he said, "Fellow workers, your strike committee has a report to make." And then they summarized the proposal from the company. and they summarized in every language that the workers spoke.
Wow.
In Arabic, in Latvian, in Greek, in French, and the last one was Yiddish. So you had both Arabic and Yiddish being spoken there. And then the workers voted, and they voted 15,000 in favor of accepting the proposal, 5 against. And so the proposal was accepted, and the strike came to an end. But this was mainly, and I think that side of it, that's really the beautiful side of the Lawrence Textile Strike. It's been kind of reduced in folklore to being this, bread and roses. Workers sang. Well, they did sing, but they sang because to keep themselves from freezing to death.
It was cold.
It wasn't the fact that they sang doesn't mean that it was some happy strike. Or that it doesn't sing. And they united together across all ethnicities that were in their factory. But that was not and could not be at that time a unity of all of the United States. I think it was a glimmer of the kind of multi-ethnic unity, it was a real working class internationalism. On display in Lawrence. It wasn't like the do-gooder multiculturalism of a certain section of the intelligence. These workers were all facing common conditions.
Yes.
And they fought together, but they faced common conditions in the factory. The thing that we have got to somehow find a way to reach the American people and talk to them about. We all face common conditions today, even though we're outside of the factory now.
Yes.
We're the huge mills in Lawrence are gone now.
Yeah.
They've been turned into little high tech companies, or the buildings have been destroyed or turned into condos or whatever. There aren't any textile mills in Lawrence anymore. So,
Daniel Brooks says, Chris, hey, Daniel, good to see you. He says, internationalizing the movement is so important. But I also think what you're raising here, this commonality that we have with each other, is what I think a lot of people don't see. That's why they don't see the commonality between them and these undocumented families coming across the border for survival. They don't see the commonality with these children that are human beings, which, right. I don't understand. I don't get it, but I think that's what maybe part of the reason that people don't feel compassion towards these children, So what do you think about this idea of internationalizing the movement that Daniel's raising?
Well, I think we have a situation where there's an international working class today. In Lawrence, they sang the song, the Internationale. On numerous occasions. At that time, that song was not associated. Later, it becomes associated with the Soviet Union, with the Communist International, a specific organization, a specific country, and a specific organization or confederation of organizations. But in Lawrence in 1912, the Internationale was like the Marseillaise. It was a battle song of all workers, and its verses about arise ye prisoners of starvation, and the international working class shall free the human race. At that time, you don't really have an international working class. You had a working class, an industrial working class in North America and in Europe, but you didn't have. In 1912 you had different national empires. You had an American empire. And American imperialism, even though, like we like to say in this country, that we're not imperialist,
right,
blah blah blah. But you had the conquest of the Philippines, the conquest of Puerto Rico, the reduction of Cuba to a protectorate, and neocolonialism in Latin America. And there was an American empire. There was also in 1912 a British empire that existed and again, it's almost 4 years exactly. 4 years and 1 month after the conclusion of the 1912 Lawrence Textile Strike, you have the Easter Uprising in Ireland. But it's 40 years until Diem Bien Phu. So you have a U.S. empire, French empire, British empire. You even have a German empire. Germany at that time has colonies in Southwest Africa and Namibia, and those get taken away from it after World War One, the Versailles Conference, but you have a German Empire, and then you have World War One, which is basically the different empires fighting each other over
Right.
the world. But you didn't have factories in Africa or in Asia. You don't have any of the stuff that we have now, where the textile production of the world is mainly in parts of the world that in 1912 were direct colonies of some European country. And so, but today we have an international, really do have an international working class. So the idea of, arise, you prisoners of starvation, the Internationale shall be the human race, we actually have the material conditions for that to come about, and the necessity of it. Because if you're gonna, right now, like I worked in the garment workers union, and it was a union that was a merger of a number of different unions, including the old garment workers union, the textile workers, and other unions as well. But only 5% of the garments worn in the United States today are manufactured in the United States.
Right.
Most of them are produced outside the United States. We couldn't get Congress to pass a law saying that the uniforms of the United States military personnel have to be manufactured in the United States. It's to the reductions to a national. They wouldn't go for it. Do you know that the uniforms worn by the Border Patrol aren't manufactured?
Oh, I wouldn't doubt it. it.
So you have this absurd situation of these people are arresting people at the border, and they've got
international uniforms,
clothes from the countries that these workers had to flee from.
Yeah,
they couldn't survive. They couldn't make enough money to survive, so they were compelled to come to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So in this environment, we can really talk about a unity of the entire world working class, and what we should take from Lawrence. Again, there's a lot of romanticizing of the strike. There were some very colorful characters who were involved in the strike. Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, others, and there's a lot of softening of the rough edges of the strike. And there were some people involved in the strike whose strategic vision was just inadequate for the. They won that strike, but then later, within just a few years, conditions had gone backwards because the main organization in the strike, the Industrial Workers of the World, was very good at agitating, but not very good at organizing on the day-to-day protection of the workers on the job between strikes, and that had consequences.
Right, and it makes sense for the workers to have organized themselves, but that's a lesson that takes time, and it's difficult to get organized when you're being treated like a factory slave, basically. That's the issue. Well, Chris, we're actually at 46 minutes, and it has been such an honor to have you on the show. I would love to continue this discussion about uniting internationally. I think that is something that we need to talk about more. We need to envision what's possible, envision a world where children aren't, in cages, where workers have the safe working conditions they need, whether they're making clothes in Vietnam or Mexico or anywhere, and to really talk about this unity that is possible. Because the ruling class definitely doesn't want us to have that conversation, and if anything, they're being more divisive with their BS that you hear on daily. But Chris, where can people find you on social media to continue to talk to you or read more of your articles? Like, do you have a blog or a Twitter account or maybe Facebook where they can find you?
Well, I'm on Facebook, so people can just, I guess Google me on Facebook or send me a Facebook request.
Okay.
I am publishing articles in the People's Tribune, so they can look for me there as well.
Sure, for sure. Do you have any articles coming up in the next issue?
We're going to be doing something about Martin Luther King and for the Martin Luther King Day.
Excellent. Well, your articles are outstanding. They're really well done. Yes, this was amazing. I learned so much. And I wish I'm going to have my kids watch the show, or my 11-year-old, because you'll understand it. But I think you taught such a wonderful lesson about unity and courage and the role that women and children had in the struggle. But just beautiful. I'm so grateful to you, Chris. Thank you. It's been an honor. I always close out. Do what you love to the max. And Chris, keep doing that history, because we need more of you. We need thousands of you to be telling and really giving us hope. You know, beautifully done. I'm so grateful to you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it.
Anytime, you're welcome back on my show. Anytime, Chris. Anytime. This has been amazing. And oh, Antonio says, hey, do you have a question for Chris? My son is saying hello. He's saying hi, Mom.
Well, hi to Antonio.
Antonio is so. You want to talk about the youth and hope? Oh my gosh! I know I already closed out the show. I am so moved by how woke the youth are today. I'm telling you, Chris, it is phenomenal just to witness in my children and my students, because many of you know I teach for a living, and I have a lot of hope for the future. We just gotta continue to have these conversations and learn from one another, and unite. All right, Chris, do you want to leave us with a parting thought?
Well, here's something to think about. That Tuesday, January 5th, there's going to be a runoff election in Georgia. And do you know that one of those Republican candidates, David Perdue, he was actually the CEO of a textile company, which he drove out of business, and hundreds and hundreds of workers lost their jobs at what used to be at a place called Pilatex, which used to be the Cannon Mill, which was a major textile scene of the 1934 textile strike. So if people get out and vote, if they defeat this guy who was a major CEO of a textile firm who treated textile workers unjustly, in a sense, we can say then that the spirit of the Lawrence Textile Strikes live. I think it's really important that we learn from history, but at the same time, we learn from it in a way that moves us forward, not to just kind of idealize it, but learn its lessons and then use it as a form of inspiration to carry on the struggle. The real homage is paid in the struggle today. So hopefully this former textile owner from down there in the South will get his comeuppance. We'll see in a couple of days.
Here.
And the struggle goes on.
Well said.
Keep learning from history, but keep making history is, I guess, what I would say.
All right, you heard it here. Keep making that history. Keep learning from history. And Chris, we're looking forward to having you next time. All right.
I'm looking forward to it too. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. This was awesome. I really enjoyed it. Well, I'm going to close out one more time. Do what you love to the max. And thank you again, Chris. Have a blessed day.